Hello, and welcome to Of Peace and Podcasts. I am your host, Aaron Gorley, and this is the podcast where you get to listen to the excellent young adult novel Of Peace and Precipitation, and then afterwards, after you hear the chapter, episode by episode, chapter by chapter, you then get a little bit of insight between the writing and, frankly, whatever else I freaking feel like talking about. Alright, but it will be great. Anyways, today's episode, we are going to be following Jen's journey with life. At the end of chapter 10, Jen was coming off from a very rough day of play practice, and it was not going well, and she was not happy, and it was a rough day. Her mom made her some food. She felt a little bit better, but now it's time to go to church, to go to the youth group, which she's not really into. She seems to like Reverend Adam fine, the youth pastor guy, but she thinks it's going to suck. And maybe it will suck. Sometimes it does. Sometimes going to church or the youth group does suck. But usually it doesn't. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. And I have many thoughts about this kind of thing from years of experience of both attending youth group as a teenager and then also helping out as an adult and also being a youth minister / youth pastor for a few years there. And I still help out with youth ministry to this very day. So I got a lot to say about that. But without further ado, we will start chapter 11. The 5-minute car ride to church passed by slowly in a circular conversation. Lena would say how much she liked Reverend Adam, and Jen would say, "Good, Mom." The cycle repeated about a half dozen times until Jen unbuckled her seatbelt and Lena said, "I'll see you at 8. As Jen closed the car door and turned to walk to the old wood and brass paneled door, she heard a faint, "I like Reverend Adam," coming from the car. Jen rolled her eyes. She looked at her watch and saw that she was still 10 minutes early. To avoid being the first one to the multi-purpose room, Jen walked towards the restroom and took out her iPod Touch. She needed to alert social media of her distraughtness. She was ever so happy she'd overheard the church's new Wi-Fi password, Predestination 777. Jen had no idea what that meant and wasn't sure how to spell it at first, but was ecstatic that her archaic church finally got Wi-Fi. About midway between the front door and the ladies' restroom, Jen heard a cheerful voice call her name. "Jen! It's Jen, right?" Reverend Adam asked, seemingly hopeful that he remembered her name. Yeah, it's Jen. Jen again took note of Reverend Adam's clothes. He wore khaki pants this time and a plain black V-neck t-shirt, the same necklace made of tiny shells that Jen had noticed last time. "Oh, okay, Jen. Well, I'm Reverend Adam, but you can just call me Adam. I'm not really used to the whole Reverend thing. I know we sort of met the other day, but not really." "Yeah," Jen said, not knowing what to say next. "Well, it's great to meet you more officially. We're going to get started just in a couple minutes. I guess we're meeting in the multi-purpose room. I'll be down there soon." Jen skipped the trip to the restroom and on her way down messaged Morgan with a one-word text, "Help." The meeting started with chairs all in a circle, which struck Jen as odd. She had never really seen this seating arrangement at church. There were only a few chairs in the circle. This was not surprising. One would probably be for her, another for Brian Browning, and whoever else was forced to come. There were about a half dozen chairs. Jen glanced at her iPod to see if Morgan had messaged her back, but she hadn't. Then Jen remembered Morgan was grounded. Jen's eyes scanned the ugly pattern of beige, brown, and red on the carpet to see a boy standing there. He wore blue jeans that were a little too short, white socks, which were more obvious because of the jeans, and white and gray sneakers. He had an old red t-shirt and thick-rimmed glasses. He slouched with his hands in his pocket and his eyes on the floor. The boy looked about Jen's age, but he seemed even more awkward and out of his element. His hair was brown and disheveled. He looks jumpy, almost like he's physically shaking. He probably has no idea what he's in for. Well, maybe he's from a different church, so he does know what he's in for. A girl with pretty straight brown hair, skinny jeans, and a Hollister t-shirt came in walking and laughing with Reverend Adam, who turned to everyone and said, Good evening, guys. Welcome. Thanks for coming. We're just going to circle up and talk for a few minutes and kind of get to know each other. During the course of a pretty lame get-to-know-you game, Jen learned that the Jumpy's boy's name was Evan and that Madison, the pretty girl from another school, was Reverend Adams' cousin. Brian Brownie was as nerdy as ever and considered himself a grand master at World of Warcraft, which Jen thought wasn't even a real thing, just something he called himself. And Reverend Adam revealed that at one point he wanted to be a professional skateboarder. Then Reverend Adam began. You know, I don't know any of you yet, but I do want to get to know you. Each one of you has a story that I would like to hear someday. You know, your story can help someone else. That's something that took me a long time to learn. When I was in junior high, I became really angry with life. I was so mad at everything. Most of the time, I didn't really even have a real reason except that I hated being different. I began to hate that I was adopted. I hated my real parents for giving me up for adoption. And I hated that I looked different. I hated that I was the only Asian kid in my whole school district. I hated that I always stood out and that everyone always thought I was smart just because I was Asian and made squinty eyes at me or called me Chinese or said I was a ninja reject or literally anything they could think of to insult me. I hated that my adopted parents could never fully understand me or what I was going through. One day I got so angry when this big dude kept teasing me and punching me in the arm every time he saw me, and then that I shoved him. And after he hit me in the stairwell, he ended up falling down the stairs and broke his leg. I got kicked out of school. I got in so much trouble. You would think that maybe it felt good to stand up for myself, but even after that, I was still so angry. My parents sent me to a psychiatrist. Reverend Adams' cousin Madison asked, "Did it help, like going to the psychiatrist?" Yeah, a little bit, but not really. It was actually one day in church when things started to change for me. Jen rolled her eyes. "Here we go. Yay, church. Church is so great. Blah, 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 blah." However, it wasn't a moment later that Reverend Adams' story piqued Jen's curiosity. Yeah, I actually hated going to church and was bored out of my mind. Jen's eyes widened when Reverend Adam confessed that he thought church was boring. And she almost let out an audible laugh. God himself only knew how many times Jen was bored out of her mind at church and hated going. Reverend Shepherd was so, "Church is the best thing in the world all the time, yay, yay, yay," that it was hard to believe someone from the church saying otherwise, even for a moment. Jen glanced at a couple of their students who had been previously staring at the floor but were now looking at Reverend Adam with full attention. So I was just sitting there in this church service. I hated going and did not want to do anything, but my parents had made me go. And I just run out of paper to draw on, so I opened up this Bible that was in the pew, really just because I was bored in my mind, not because I really wanted to read it. Well, I opened it up and it fell to the book of Jeremiah. And I remember thinking it was funny because a kid in my class named Jeremiah had recently peed his pants. So anyways, I started reading, and it's talking about the nation of Israel or something. All of a sudden, I see this verse. I'll never forget it. It said, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future." I know that seems like a random verse from the Bible, but I knew for some reason that this verse was talking about me. The actual context of the verse was about the nation of Israel, but I knew that God was also speaking to me at that moment. I don't know how I knew, but I just knew. I knew that it was God saying that even though my life had hit a pretty rough patch, and even though I was angry and depressed, God still had plans for me. Good things that I would experience later, and I'm still experiencing this today. I felt that in that moment that he hadn't given up on me. So I'm still in the middle of this church service, and it was crazy. I'm starting to tear up in church of all places. I'm trying to be this tough junior high kid, and the last thing I wanted with someone from my family see that I'm crying and having this moment in church. I wanted my parents to know I hated church, so I did my best I could to keep anyone from noticing. I don't think they noticed, but it was something I'll never forget. To be real, it wasn't even that day when things started to change for me. It was a few days later. I could have put that moment in the back of my mind, and I was still sort of angry and depressed. But a few days later, at my new school, this really quiet kid was getting picked on. He was black, and they called him all kinds of racist names, and were just really cruel to him, just like they were to me at my old school. So I see this kid in the hall crying by himself after these boys were picking on him. For whatever reason, I think about that verse I read it in church, and I kind of feel bad for the kid. So I go over and started talking to him, and it turns out that he had been adopted too, and he was living with a white family too. Long story short, we became friends. To this day, Malik is one of my best friends. This was sort of a turning point for my anger to begin to go away. I think there was something about me helping someone else and some of their problems that helped me begin to stop hating myself and others for being different. There's this other verse in 2 Corinthians that says, God comforts us in all our troubles so that we may comfort others with the hope that we have in God. So, sorry to go on and on and on, but that was just a story about a time where I was able to help someone because of something that happened to me. Sometimes we think, I'm not special, there's not anything I can do. But the reality is that God made you who you are. He made you special. Whether you believe that or think that that's lame or whatever, it doesn't make it any less true. I feel like I've been babbling going on forever, so I'll end with this. I hope that this is something you're able to realize, that you are special and that God does have great plans for your life. You never know the people you might be able to help. Reverend Adam closed in prayer. Although the prayer was shorter than many she'd experienced at church, Jen really wasn't listening. She was puzzled at Reverend Adam's story. He seemed so normal, so not church-like, yet his story was clearly very religious. It also struck Jen that Reverend Adam thought God spoke to him. Just an odd thought. God, the silent one up in the sky, communicating to someone. I mean, Reverend Adam seems cool and all, but was he a little crazy? Reverend Adam didn't seem crazy. So if God really talked to him, why him? Why was God silent towards me? Towards my mom? Reverend Adam probably just had a breakdown or something, and maybe he just thought his own weird thoughts were God. Just like our church, to bring someone crazy to work with the teens. And that was chapter 11. You have to be crazy to work with teens in general, I think. So, anyways, that was chapter 11. That was her first time at the youth group, and I think it went okay. I think she liked it okay. A couple little writing things. The beginning of the chapter talk about a circular conversation. Those are one of those can be so irritating when you're in a conversation where you're like saying one thing and the person just kind of like says back their thing and that. I feel like I get arguments with my wife like that where I'm saying one thing and she's saying the same thing again. It just goes around in a circle. And oh my gosh, no, I'm just kidding. I love you, baby. I got you. She's probably listening at some point, so I love you, baby. All right, but no, whenever you have those, it's kind of annoying. And Lena is definitely a person that would do that kind of thing. And then also, quick shout out to from the Wi-Fi password Predestination 777. That's a little shout out to Geneva College. That was my college I went to. It was very Reformed Presbyterian and taught many such theological concepts and that I didn't always agree with, but nonetheless, I always appreciated that they took their biblical studies very, very seriously, and I definitely learned a lot of things, and I overall had a really good experience there. So, shout out to there. So yeah, I mean, with this chapter, it's just a lot about like youth ministry, and again, that's been something that I know I've probably mentioned this in the past, but that's something that I have a lot of experience in, both like in being a student. I was in youth ministry when I was in middle school. I started going, I didn't really like coming at all, but they did have like a gym, so I enjoyed playing basketball, and I did that a lot. And it was kind of like, hey, hurry up, get this service over so I can go like play basketball, And I made sure to get there a couple minutes early, so I could play basketball before and after service. So I remember being like I was always like really upset if like someone was like using the gym for something like before or after service, But nonetheless, I had a good experience with that, and I still to this day just really I care about students and want to do whatever I can to kind of help them, or because it's hard being a teenager sometimes, for sure. And Reverend Adam, it's funny, he's like, I don't really do the whole reverend thing, and a lot of Protestant churches don't really do. Most of the churches I've experienced with, they don't really use that term reverend. That's more, I think that's maybe like a more traditional term or whatever. Usually pastor, where they just go by their name. But either way, so Reverend Adam's doesn't really love the reverend term, but that's like what his like boss, kind of like Reverend Shepherd, refers to him, so he kind of just goes with it. But I think Jen kind of likes him. I think Jen appreciates the fact that he's kind of like a real person. He's like on a real. And to me, that's always been something that I appreciate in a pastor, is that someone that's real. Like, just be real with me. Don't put on like a spiritual front. Now, obviously, it's like church, and we're in this religious context, so like I don't mind if obviously I don't mind talking about spiritual things or whatever, religious things, but I don't like whenever I get like this, like in a vibe that like we're fake, or we're putting on this like front, that we're being like, we're putting on like a front, or not being like themselves. And that's kind of something for me that when I was like a full-time youth pastor for a few years there, that was always something for me that I was like, I knew I'm not gonna put on this front, like I'm gonna be the same person. I'm really kind of the same person everywhere, and I'm definitely when I was youth pastor and stuff for a few years there, I just was always myself, and I think that's just an important thing, just to be yourself. And I think that's something that Jen appreciates of Reverend Adam. And there's a lot of excellent churches out there. There's a lot of churches where just people are just real. I have friends that I'm to the age where a lot of my friends are now like the lead pastors of like churches and stuff. I had a couple kids that like I grew up with, I went to high school with, are now like pastors of these huge churches, and they're doing such an amazing job, and they're such good and like genuine people. And I think that's really important too. If you've ever had a bad experience of church, or if you ever felt like people were being kind of fake or whatever, my wife and I talk about this. We've been going to churches forever, and churches are just never perfect. I think I've even mentioned this in our podcast before, but never going to be perfect, because people are there, and people are not perfect, and people do and say stupid things, even if they generally have good intentions. But it's really been a blessing in my life overall, for the most part. And then the last kind of part, the end of the chapter, Reverend Adams said that he, actually, one of the things that he talked about, I want to kind of say in passing, he said that he asked, one of the students asked him, hey, well, did it help going to counseling? And he kind of like said, like, yeah, it did, but not really. He kind of like said yes and no kind of thing. I am a big proponent of counseling. I think it's a really helpful thing. So like, even though I wrote like in the thing that like it helped, but it didn't, because people do have that experience as well. There's times where that is a really real experience. So I am a big proponent in counseling. My sister-in-law Michelle, who's a wonderful person, is a counselor, and I don't go for her for counseling, although sometimes she turns conversations, normal ones, like into like counseling sessions. But Michelle, I tell you, no, she's a wonderful person. But anyways, and she's probably an excellent counselor just from the vibe I got, but obviously conflict of interest for her to be my counselor. And I've been to counseling before, and mental health counseling, so I really am a proponent of it. But there are people that had mixed experience with it, where like it felt like it didn't really help them, or helped them only a little bit. And Reverend Adam kind of says in passing, he says, he said it wasn't until I was able to kind of help, like, meet this other kid, and this other kid, Malik, and kind of like reach out to him, that I felt like it was getting better. And I think that's like a normal thing. I mean, there's something about setting your own problems aside and looking to the problems of others that I think can really, really be like happy. And I probably talked about this in this podcast before, but I think there's just like a special thing to where, like, when you're only focused on your own problems, it tends to be something that you just focus on. You're like you're so consumed with your own stuff that you don't realize that other people are going through things too. And in this case, just him like not thinking about it and going to helping this Malik kid, and then just having a new friend. I think that really makes a big difference. I've been reading this excellent graphic novel in my classes about it's called Almost American Girl, and it's about this girl coming from Korea. And I think I've actually talked about this before, but this girl comes over from Korea, and the turning point in the story, she really has a really, really tough time living in the United States, and the turning point in her life is just making friends. And I think just having people that you can talk to is such a huge thing. And I feel like we're getting to the point that we're like, 11 episodes in, so you're starting to kind of hear me say some of the same stuff that I've talked about earlier in this podcast. But a lot of it I really believe, so it's easy for me to like kind of bring up again. But people are healthiest when they're in community, when they have people around them that they can like talk to and interact with, and they don't feel like they're alone. And I think Reverend Adam here in this situation, that was kind of the turning point in his life, where he was able to have community with someone and have like some new friends that really helped him out. It's really hard for people when you feel alone, like kind of Reverend Adam felt for the time. And again, kids are brutal, man. They like just love to like talk terrible to each other, especially back a few years ago when Reverend Adam's talking about like his time way back when he was in like middle school and high school. And I feel like it's a little bit better now. I think people are maybe a lot more aware of that, and they are trying their best to not say inappropriate things or disrespectful things to other people, to think things are better. But back in the day, it still happens. Let's just be real. I know for me, that's something that I don't at all accept in many of my classes. Like, we are, like it or not, you don't have to be best friends with everybody, but you need to be respectful to each other. And that's a really, really big thing I push in my class. But, I don't eat lunch with the kids. I don't go to recess with kids. I'm not in between classes. I am somewhat in between classes, but like, that's when those things kind of happen more, is that, when they're away from the teachers, or like I think I said, like in the stairwell, he would do that. I actually, when I was a freshman in high school, I had some kid that would always come up and just punch me in my arm as hard as he could. And it was not a good, I kind of hated it. And I was just like, bro, what the crap? Like, I did nothing to you. I've never said one bad word to you. And you just like run up and punch me. He was actually a lot like smaller than me, the kid. He was like pretty tough kid. Like, he like played like football and basketball with me. So he was tough for his size, but he was a lot smaller than me and not particularly stronger or anything like that. But like, it was hard. It was just like, what is going on? Like, why are you like picking at me like for no reason? And here this kid is even more so like just getting picked on just for being from a different race and stuff. And I work in the inner city, where that's not as it's kind of like everybody's different. But back if you're talking about out in the middle of nowhere in Ohio, kind of where Jen lives, it's a different story, where you can be like one of the only people that are different in your school. It's very possible. So anyways, as we move on, we'll see if Jen continues to like the youth group okay, and how it goes, and how things continue to go on that front of her life. And next chapter 12, We're going to get a little bit of Jen's kind of like family background. She's going to talk about her dad for the first time in the story. And, I think the chapter gives a lot of like, shows a lot about like maybe some of the things that shape Jen. And I've heard from several people this is one of the best chapters in the book. That's very well written and everything. So, all of it's really well written because I wrote it. No, I'm just kidding. But I did hear that feedback and everything. It's always nice to hear like, oh, okay. Because I felt like it turned out pretty good and whatever. So you will have to hear next episode, chapter 12. All right. So much love to all the people here. Thank you for listening. I hope you're like enjoying this. And I ramble a little bit sometimes. So if I'm rambling too much, just skip the next episode and listen to a nice audiobook chapter by chapter. All right. Much love to all of you guys, and goodbye.